I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on understanding the African Continental Free Trade Area and how the U.S. can promote its success. I hope that we can use this discussion to examine the origins of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, as well as its goals and actualization on the continent. This hearing is an opportunity for members to identify ways U.S. foreign assistance and trade policy can be used most effectively to advance the agenda set by the African Union and African leaders. I would like to begin first by thanking our witnesses, the Honorable Mene, the Secretary General of the AfCFTA, Ambassador Mwencha, Chairman of the Equity Bank, Dr. Landry, Signé, a Brookings Senior Fellow focused on Africa, and Ms. Florizelle Liser, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. I look forward to hearing your testimony and discussing meaningful and viable steps the U.S. should take to deepen our trade and investment partnership with Africa. This hearing is exactly the discussion that I'm hoping to have, as it focuses on shifting the paradigm of U.S.-Africa policy from humanitarian assistance and crises, both of which are essential but are not the only discussions we should have. Building, supporting, and nurturing strong partnerships with the continent as it moves towards self-reliance, regional integration, and better access to quality education, care, and jobs, all while creating greater trade and communication linkages to other African nations, which will also improve trade dynamics with the rest of the world. This shift will create a continent that showcases diversified exports, expanded manufacturing and export industries, greater integration into the global supply chain with higher value inputs that capitalizes upon its innovation and inherent advantages to strengthen the continent, its nation states, and its global partnerships. The Continental Free Trade Area, now ratified by 54 of 55 states, was designed by the African Union to economically unify African states for the purposes of shared economic development progress. As we know, the U.S. and the AU enjoy a strong relationship with a history of cooperation and partnership. As the first non-African country to establish a diplomatic mission to the AU in 2006, the United States has continued to work with the AU towards shared diplomatic, economic, and security goals. Promoting the free trade area is just another level of support to the AU and should be the focus of U.S. assistance and trade policy to deepen engagement that will improve the quality of life of all Africans while growing financial markets and jobs for U.S. businesses. According to the CRS document, however, our investment in supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area is much smaller than the EU or China. And so I would like to hear from witnesses where our investment should be increased, in what areas. We have seen success in areas of economic growth and trade historically through AGOA, Power Africa, Feed the Future, and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. AGOA, the landmark legislation for trade between Africa and the U.S., has bolstered trade, economic growth, and relations with the U.S. and sub-Saharan Africa for over 20 years. It's my contention that reauthorizing AGOA with the appropriate amendments and resources is one of the best efforts the U.S. can lend to the success of the free trade area. In addition, the U.S. must look at other means of support, such as industry advisory boards and funds for investment institutions. I think it would be meaningful for the DFC and the Secretariat to discuss ways forward to improve the trade initiatives on the continent, and would like to hear your thoughts as well. DFC's work on the continent amplifies investments in critical sectors, including education, power, growing small and medium enterprises, and agriculture. However, I believe a strategic relationship with the Secretariat could rapidly facilitate intra-continental trade agreements in a more practical sense, such as digitalizing of border crossing and standardized customs procedures. We face a critical time when the world is working collectively to overcome the COVID pandemic and the impacts of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. This is an opportunity to promote continental and international trade of African commodities, goods, and services that, if managed properly, can lead to a greater participation in global markets and sustainable social economic advancement across the continent. It's in the United States' national and economic security interests to support the free trade area through technical, financial, and other foreign assistance. I look forward to witness testimony that offers recommendations on the best strategies to support the agreement, whether it be through improving AGOA or other methods to move the U.S.-Africa relationship forward. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making his opening statement. I believe that the ranking member is going to be joining us in a minute. So I will move to introduce our first witness. And then before the witnesses finish, if the ranking member comes in, we will give him time to do his opening statement. His Excellency Mene was elected by the 33rd Ordinary Session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Governments of the African Union to the position of Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Prior to being elected, Secretary General Mene served as Chief Director of Africa Economic Relations and the Director of International Trade Law and Investment Law at the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa. Next, we have Ambassador Mwencha, starting as one of the first employees as the then preferential trade area. The ambassador went on to serve as the Secretary General of the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. In that role, he launched Africa's first free trade area and the African Trade Insurance Agency, a multilateral investment agency. After COMESA, the ambassador was elected deputy chairperson of the African Union Commission and was the architect of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Since leaving the AU, he now concurrently serves as the chairman of the Equity Bank and Trade Market of East Africa. Dr. Landry Signé is a leading professor and practitioner who has won over 70 prestigious awards and distinctions globally for his academic, policy, business, and leadership accomplishments. He has received the fastest reported tenure and promotion to the highest rank of full professor in the history of the U.S. universities in his discipline. He is the managing director and professor at the Thunderberg School of Global Management, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, distinguished fellow at Stanford University, and a member of the World Economics Forum's Regional Action Group for Africa. And our final witness is Ms. Florizelle Liser. She is the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. She brings expertise and an extensive network on trade in Africa, along with the strong track record of working with the private sector to translate policy into action. She is the first woman to lead the council since its founding in 1993. Ms. Liser joined CCA from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she was the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa since 2003 and was absolutely essential to the reauthorization of AGOA. We appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Your written statements will appear in the hearing record, and under Committee Rule 6, each witness should limit your presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. And before the first witness testifies, I'm notified that the ranking member has joined us, so let me take a moment for his opening statement, and then we will go directly into your testimony. Mr. Smith. Is Mr. Smith with us? Okay, why don't we go directly into our testimony from the Secretariat?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair Bass. It is a pleasure for me to join you today and along with the fellow witnesses. It's a very important day for us because this is an expression, at least to me, it expresses the interest of the United States in the work that we are doing to integrate our market, to liberalize trade on the African continent, and to make sure that, as you said in your opening statement, that we see economic prosperity. We submitted our testimony but in accordance with your instructions, I will provide an overview, a summary of that testimony. The first thing I should say is to acknowledge that although we today have 42 countries that have ratified the agreement that establishes the AfCFTA, and only one African country has not yet signed the agreement, all of this may appear as if it happened in a relatively short space of time, which it did. But we stand on the shoulders of people like Ambassador Mwencha, the former chairperson of the African Union Commission, Madam Dlamini Zuma, and others who really pushed very, very hard in the early stages to make sure that what appears to have been very, very rapid progress, that actually it is built on very, very solid ground. We have a trade agreement that is comprehensive in scope, that is very, very ambitious, high-level ambition agreement. It includes trade in goods, trade in services, a protocol on dispute settlement, a protocol on digital trade, investment protection, competition policy, what in the US I suppose we refer to as antitrust, as well as, more importantly, a protocol on women and youth in trade to ensure inclusivity as we trade amongst ourselves. You may be aware that the statistics that we have today are not encouraging. 18% intra-Africa trade, a fragmentation of markets throughout our vast continents, and of course, in many cases, smallness of national economies. However, there's a very, very unique opportunity through the AfCFTA to change all of that, to change the character of Africa's economy by leveraging on this market of 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP today of 3.4 trillion United States dollars, projected by the year 2035 to be close to 7 trillion United States dollars. That is consumer spending as well as business spending. And so the level of ambition is very high. That is why we have identified these core areas of Africa's economy to make sure that we integrate, to make sure that we have a single set of rules for trade and investment, and to make sure that we position the African continent for competitiveness, not only regionally, but for competitiveness globally. We are now at the very early stages of implementing this agreement. We have agreed on an 88% of rules of origin in the area of trade in goods, which of course is critical. This is the nuts and bolts of any trade agreement, are the rules of origin. So if you think about it this way, of over 5,000 traded products in Africa, we've reached a consensus on a single set for these rules of origin on 88% of the products that are traded. We have also operationalized the dispute settlement protocol, which is a very important protocol to send a signal, not only to foreign investors, but also to African investors, exporters, and traders, to send a very strong signal that we are committed to resolving trade, investment disputes, resolving them through rules, predetermined rules that we have crafted in the protocol on dispute settlement. Now, if I may spend the last few minutes that I have to explain why I believe this should be a different trade agreement, and why I believe we have a very unique opportunity to push back on the narrative that trade agreements benefit only the large corporations and that benefit only the elite across countries and regions. This has been the narrative that we are all aware of. I think if we do a number of things, we will be able to change this narrative. First, if we focus on small, medium enterprises that are led by women and young people as part of implementation of a trade agreement, and there are various digital tools that we can introduce to enable exactly that objective of inclusivity, we will be on the right track. Second, if we focus on trade corridors to ensure that our trade corridors are competitive enough to enable trade to happen across regions of the African continent. And I think we can achieve this too by introducing technology of customization, of harmonization of custom systems, which is already made provision for in the agreement. We would be integrating not only from a legal text point of view, but if we introduce these customs systems, we would be integrating on the continent from a trade point of view, all the customs procedures that different countries today have different customs procedures, which is part of the reason why countries have remained trapped in smallness of national economies. And so I believe with the help of the United States and our friends, we can introduce digital systems for harmonization of customs procedures. The other important aspect of inclusivity as to why this agreement must be different and why it is so important that we focus on these areas that I am mentioning now is industrial development and industrialization, focusing on key specific value chains. 4 value chains that we have identified that have the highest potential of enhancing inclusivity in terms of implementation of a trade agreement: agriculture, the automotive sector, pharmaceuticals, transport, and logistics. With the help of the MasterCard Foundation, this study, that when it was presented to us, the observations were astounding, that we can contribute $11 billion annually to Africa's trade GDP and create over 750,000 jobs, mainly young people and small medium enterprises that are led by women, if we mobilize investment in these value chains. For example, when we were in the US recently, we had a very good discussion with the US Chamber of Commerce about how do we mobilize the investment that we need in the pharmaceutical sector, so that the pharmaceutical sector can become part of the regional value chains and the trade that we want to see, that we want to create across regions of the African continent. So there are various interventions. I've just mentioned only 4 or 5 various interventions that we can make, which I believe are absolutely critical to ensuring the long-term success of this agreement. You mentioned, Chairwoman, you mentioned, Chairman, in your initial remarks, you mentioned the Development Finance Corporation. I think there's a lot of scope for us to get support, support which is not going to be, just aid that is provided in terms of a health crisis, but support that will be long-term and enable small medium enterprises to expand their markets, not only intra-Africa, but to expand their markets also into the US under AGOA. And so I believe that this is a very, very unique opportunity that we have. I think that this is something that when the leaders convene in September, when and where that meeting happens, the US Africa Leaders Forum, I think trade and investment issues should be at the fore of their agenda. Yes, there are problems with peace and security. Those problems will always be there. But I believe if we solve the trade and investment challenge, that enables us to deal also with other issues of terrorism,
Thank you.
of extremism that we see in other parts of our continent. So I want to thank you very much. I see I've slightly exceeded my time. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I could not agree with you more in terms of the emphasis and the priority. Ambassador Mwencha, it's wonderful to see you again. I've visited you many times when you were at the AU in Addis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's good to see you again. May I also recognize ranking member and esteemed members. I'm so happy to be testifying here together with my colleagues,, Florizelle Liser, and Landry Signé. Perhaps to put this subject into context, since 2000 and 2020, the US investment in Africa is $50 billion, meaning 0.8% of total US investment abroad. And I think this is the context under which I would like to analyze this subject by emphasizing the need for us to strengthen AGOA and also institutions or instruments like Prosper Africa within the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Perhaps to put it under proper perspective, I should underline that we want to engage in the 21st century trade arrangements that is based on shared values and the shared benefits as opposed to market access. And for that, we should also ascribe some of the points that have been raised by my colleague Mene concerning developing modern and critical supply chains, small and medium enterprises, digitizing, particularly for cross-border, building resilience, critical supply chains, and also promoting environmental protection and high standard of labor. Now, when you looking at AGOA in perspective, and which has been a very good instrument for the last 20 years, some of the challenges that face AGOA is that it is not a negotiated arrangement, and therefore it is not stable, it's not predictable. This is one of the reasons why AGOA has not generated a lot of investment in Africa. But we want to propose here that for that to be able to play that role, AGOA should be extended along the lines of CBI. And also, some of the tariff rate quota products should also be included. But I want then to propose some three aspects of how we want to see US support the Continental Free Trade Area. One is first, we would encourage that we support the Continental Free Trade Area by not engaging in bilateral trade arrangements. I argued when there was this arrangement between Kenya and the US, I know it was not unpopular then, nor was it popular in my own country, Kenya, because I believe if we don't strengthen the Continental Free Trade Area, we cannot benefit from economies of scale and all the benefits that Secretary Mene has mentioned. The second one is encouraging outward investment from the US. Prosper Africa coordinates some 17 US institutions. I don't need to mention them. But here again, we should focus on the key areas that Africa is looking for, particularly in infrastructure. Africa infrastructure deficit is over $100 billion per annum, and the US needs to move into the sector, covering the areas of energy. The second one, and Secretary has mentioned, is value addition, particularly in agriculture and mining sectors. And thirdly, to also support the service sector, which is important, particularly the supply chains. I should mention here that it will be remiss on my part if I didn't thank the USAID for having agreed to support its support to trademark East Africa, which, as Secretary Mene has indicated, is supporting along the corridors that will also be looking at issues to do with green corridors, but also inclusive, particularly for women in business and also small and medium-scale enterprises, in addition to reducing cost of doing business. Finally, I want to believe that given the large population of African Americans, those recently migrated and indigenous, we should also encourage them to be able to access the American investment, because with that, you have 46 million people who should be able to support investment, outward investment in Africa, but also encourage other US investment into Africa. And finally, I should also here encourage that for AGOA to be able to incentivize the Continental Free Trade Area, those products which qualify in Africa for quota-free, duty-free in Africa should also qualify under AGOA. In addition, AGOA should be extended right away without having to go beyond 2022. Otherwise, the 5-year period is also a constraint. It should be given a longer period, more than 2030, so that you can encourage investment. And for countries under sanction, we would encourage that we look for instruments that do not punish those companies that really are not involved in the instances that lead to sanctions, and there should be instruments that can be used for this, for instance, APRM processes in Africa. This way, AGOA then will be able to be stable and will encourage trade between US and Africa to benefit from economies of scale, where US companies can benefit, and for the mutual benefit of both sides of the Atlantic. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Signé?
Thank you very much, Chair Karen Bass, ranking members Smith, and distinguished members of this subcommittee for your extraordinary leadership on US-Africa relations. So I am incredibly honored and grateful for the opportunity offered to me to really testify on the AfCFTA. So I also want to recognize my fellow distinguished panelists, Wamkele, Mwencha, and Liser. So I am Landry Signé, and Managing Director and Professor at Thunderbird, and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Africa Growth Initiative. And please allow me to applaud the Biden administration for the US-Africa Leaders Summit and other business initiatives which are being planned for 2022. Critical tools to boost US-Africa trade and investment. My recommendation on how the US can promote the AfCFTA build on the fact that the AfCFTA represent a monumental opportunity to positively transform Africa and advance US-Africa trade and investment, as by 2050, Africa's combined consumer and business spending will exceed 16 trillion US dollar for a population of more than 2.5 billion people and a combined GDP exceeding 29 trillion US dollar. So the first recommendation, the US government should develop new regional and continental investment vehicles that go beyond sovereign guarantees to foster cross-border investment, with agencies such as the GFC, the US Export-Import Bank, the Trade and Development Agency, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which has started with some of the cross-regional initiative. And the US Treasury could also develop measures, including fiscal incentives and tax credit on investment conducted by US corporations in Africa. The US Small Business Administration and Minority Business Development Agency should be provided with more resources to facilitate SMEs and diaspora expansion in cross-border trade. And the USTR should be represented in relevant agencies, and the leadership of Prosper Africa could be further empowered, turning the COO role into a CEO role to boost agility. So second, the US government should contribute to the expansion of manufacturing output to boost US-Africa trade. For example, the US African Development Foundation could be provided with more resources, and the GFC could leverage on the Fund for Export Development in Africa by the Afrexim Bank and the African Development Bank to channel more resources towards growth of SMEs and infrastructure development. Third, the US government, especially the US Treasury, should support the allocation of unused special drawing rights issued by the IMF towards the recapitalization of African development finance institutions, such as AfDB, African Exim Bank, among others, to boost US-African trade. Fourth, the US government should invest in the digital economy, digital infrastructure, and education to really, and as well as to bridge the digital skill and human capital gap, while ensuring privacy and cyber security. And there, programs such as Connect Africa, Power Africa could be expanded, and American university could also be supported to develop programs in Africa. Fifth, when engaging with Africa, the US government should ideally pursue multilateral agreements through the AfCFTA to AGOA, and the US government should also design what the future of US-Africa trade will look like after 2025, because it's extremely important to provide that vision for long-term investor. And AGOA also could be extended in a way which focuses on reciprocal trade concession with the region as a whole. Six, the US government, especially USAID, the Department of State or DFC, could also play a vital role here in lending support and financial resources to the AfCFTA for institutional development, and also support individual countries for the AfCFTA successful implementation. In closing, by acting promptly and forging transformative partnership, the US really has the unique opportunity not only to advance its own interest, but also contribute to the transformation of Africa and successful implementation of the AfCFTA. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, Madam CEO, Ms. Liser.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And just have to say that I'm honored to be here at this hearing today with those also on the panel, longtime friends and colleagues, and a special thanks to the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, especially Chairman Bass and Ranking Member Chris Smith. I think you know who I am, so I won't waste time on that. CCA, as you know, has been a long-standing and the benefits of US-Africa trade, and is very focused on how do we expand and build on that. This is the right time to look at how the US can support implementation of the historic AfCFTA, as well as strengthen the US trade and investment relationship with Africa. Countries on the continent are, as you know, recovering from the health and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, moving forward in their post-pandemic recovery strategies, attempting to manage the new challenge and impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, and looking to get back on track in spurring growth and creating jobs. The United States is at an important crossroads in Africa economic policy. Since its enactment in 2000, AGOA, now set to expire in 2025, has been the cornerstone of the US economic policy towards Africa. But in the interim, Africa has become much more sophisticated and better integrated globally since 2000. Africa is now, as we've all been here talking about, in the process of implementing AfCFTA Phase 1, as well as negotiating Phase 2, which will look at important issues like investment protections, intellectual property rights, competition policy, et cetera. And when fully implemented, the 54 country African AfCFTA will create the largest free trade area in the world, connecting 1.3 billion people across the 54 countries with a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion. However, achieving AfCFTA's full potential will depend on each member country putting in place significant policy reforms, including measures to improve their business climates, promote good governance, support private sector-led growth that creates jobs, and invest in their businesses, especially SME, youth, and women-owned enterprises. So AfCFTA is indeed a game changer for Africa's own economic integration and regional trade. But let me just shift the lens a bit by also highlighting why Africa is important to the US and how supporting AfCFTA implementation will help pull African products and services into global value chains, boost trade-related investment, and potentially increase much-needed US-Africa trade and investment. While Africa is complex, its strategic and economic relevance to the US is clear. I have lots of facts, but let me just stick with this one or two. By the year 2025, more than half the population of Africa will be under age 25, and by 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be African. With all of this in mind, the US would best serve its own interests by recognizing that the USG can be one of Africa's best partners, and US companies are natural commercial partners. US support for AfCFTA should be a critical component of US economic engagement with Africa, and the US should put in place policies and programs and initiatives. I love the ones that Landry talked about that support AfCFTA implementation, such as technical assistance to the Secretariat, to individual African governments, and at the firm level. And this can be provided by a wide range of US government agencies and programs: Prosper Africa, DFC, Exim Bank, SBA, USTDA, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and others, but also through commercial partnerships between US and African companies, both large and small, and linking US women, minority, and diaspora-owned SMEs to their counterparts on the continent. Let me urge that the committee and USG provide as soon as possible clarity about how we're going to move forward. What will our US-Africa economic relationship be like? And this will help not only our African partners, but will signal to US companies, investors, and potential investors how they should proceed. Let me mention 3 or 4 quick bullets on things I think have to change or need to be done beyond AGOA. I think AGOA should be extended, but I think it should cover all African countries. Why should we have any US initiative now that separates Africa into 2 groups, Sub-Saharan and North African, when AfCFTA is bringing all of them together? Let's have all the countries of Africa under whatever program and initiative we do, including AGOA. Let's also not just look at goods, but how can we pull in services? Services contributes more to African GDP than goods does. So to have an agreement with Africa that doesn't address services, I think should be a non-starter at this point. Third, we need to incentivize investment, especially into manufacturing and value addition, into regional and global value chains. And I'm happy to talk about ways that I think that can happen. But that is really critical, that we incentivize investment into that part of Africa's future and prosperity: manufacturing, value addition. And finally, a 4th point would be to support partnerships between African SMEs, especially youth and women-owned, with women, minority, and diaspora-owned businesses here in the US. That would meet 2 goals of equity: equity in terms of Africa, but also equity in terms of the US. So let me just say that I thank you for this opportunity. CCA looks forward to working with the members of Congress and the US government, the AfCFTA Secretariat, African governments, and of course, the private sector of both the US and Africa, to develop a multifaceted approach that will grow and enhance the US-Africa economic relationship. Thanks.
And thank you. And we'll now proceed into questions, and each member will have 5 minutes. I will begin. I'd like to ask the Secretariat, how are countries on the continent responding to what is going on in Ukraine and the impact of wheat? I mean, I was really shocked to know how much wheat is imported from Ukraine and how that's being disrupted. So I'm asking you this question in the context of, as you're trying to develop the free trade area, when you have a crisis happening, like a famine or a wheat shortage, do you do anything differently? Do you adjust to respond to that crisis, or do you just continue moving forward? Because right away, what came to mind for me is Africa's capacity to grow wheat as opposed to importing it. And maybe you could comment, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Well, I think there are two things that have defined our trade, intra-Africa trade approach since we were established: COVID-19 and the situation in Ukraine. You are absolutely correct. Many countries on the African continent are overly reliant on the imports of wheat from Ukraine. And now that the crisis is getting worse and worse, as we see, the situation of food security in Africa is being impacted. We are seeing prices of basic food increasing. We are seeing anxiety about food insecurity. And so this is a crisis, but it is also an opportunity for us to use the AfCFTA to accelerate our capacity at productive generation of food, to include farmers who are today, who may be smallholder farmers, but to ensure that they become part of Africa's food security value chain and the food that we trade on the continent. Some of this has been done before in previous crises, the rice crisis of 2008, 2009. We saw some improvement in Africa's capacity at productive providing and value-added food stuffs on our continent. I think we have to do the same. The second crisis is, of course, COVID-19. We were born as a Secretariat in the middle of a global pandemic. So I don't know what it means to operate under normal circumstances from a trade point of view. And what we did at that point was to introduce trade corridors that would enable the transit of goods, faster transit of goods, when borders were closed, as they were across the continent and across the world at the height of the global pandemic. And so what we've learned from these two crises is, number one, we've got to accelerate Africa's industrial capacity. We've got to accelerate Africa's manufacturing capacity, as Ambassador Mwencha and Flori said. We have to make sure that on these value chains that I mentioned, agriculture, transport and logistics, the automotive sector, these are the areas that, according to our studies, present us the potential to accelerate this industrialization, to build the capacity of countries, small, medium enterprises, to export, not only under the AfCFTA, but also under AGOA. And so in the short term, I think that's what we need to do. In the long term is to mobilize investment in these very critical value chains. In the short term, what we are, when our ministers of trade meet, we will recommend to them that actually, if we had a longer time frame for reducing barriers to trade, particularly in food, let us bring that time frame to a much narrower time frame. In other words, let us accelerate the tariff reduction that is set out in the timeline of the agreement from 5 years to actually now. There is no need for us to wait 5 years to trade in critical agricultural products that are needed. That's something that we can do now, and we can do ourselves now, to make sure that we improve food security on the African continent. So I see this short-term measure of accelerating liberalization of trade in food, and a long-term measure of boosting our capacity, our productive capacity in these value chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have some other questions, but my time has expired, so I want to go to Representative Issa, and then we'll have another round when all the members have had a chance to ask their questions.
I apologize. Give me a second to close that.
Okay.
Okay. One of the, I'm going to follow up on the earlier question on food security, if I could. Historically, Africa, particularly Zimbabwe, was a major wheat producer that has diminished and not returned. Within the African continent, within your internal free trade, are there plans to find a way to restore the kind of production that obviously is available on those very fertile lands?
Who are you directing that to, Mr. Issa?
To Mr. Mene, it seems to be the one who best could answer it, but I can go on to another question if that's maybe outside of the trade. It does. I guess the follow-up question here on another area is, Mr. Mwencha, you said that you noted that $50 billion had been invested. And that's direct investment. The question I have is, what areas do you believe, had we put additional $500 million, whatever amount, that specifically would have had a return? And if you could give me examples where China's investments of their dollars has in fact given the kind of return you're seeking.
Thank you, Honorable Issa. Thank you very much for your question. One of the areas where Africa has always lagged behind is in infrastructure. And as I said earlier on, if you look at the infrastructure deficit, particularly compared to world standards, average world standards, Africa needs over 100 billion US dollars. And these are areas like roads, rail, and air transport, but also energy, which is very critical. I know a lot of work has been done, particularly Power Africa, but also in the area of services. And this point was emphasized by Flori. Now, where are these returns? What Africa has always been challenged with is government-to-government kind of investment. And this is where countries like China come in. But there is also an opportunity, particularly PPPs, public-private partnerships. And we believe that US companies have the capacity, especially in the area of energy. There are areas like solar energy, where Africa still offers a lot of opportunities. And I want to endorse what Flori said, that if we think of the continent as a whole, think of the Sahel, the potential for energy there, how Africa then would have that capacity to be able to power industrialization. The other part, of course, if you go to a country like DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, you have huge opportunities in that country. For instance, you have one of the largest hydroelectric dam, which could power the entire continent. But this project has remained in the books because we have not been able to attract investment. So there are investment opportunities which we believe the US private sector can take advantage of, invest either private to private, but also public. And these are the areas we're also encouraging. Partly, perhaps I should indicate here, especially in the mining sector, Africa is losing its minerals, selling it as raw minerals without value addition. And we have, for example, today, Africa is sitting on products that can power, for example, electric cars to the future. But these areas still no investment. we are still exporting those raw materials that can be used in that. These are some of the areas we are encouraging to bring US investment to Africa to participate in value addition, but also in those sectors that can take us forward to the future. Let me answer the question you mentioned on Zimbabwe. And this is one of the reasons that perhaps I mentioned in my testimony, that when we apply sanctions, perhaps we could do it in a way that they can be targeted, but not affect the private sector itself. Zimbabwe was a basket of agriculture in Southern Africa. But obviously, because of the sanctions, a lot of those companies have had to fold and go away because of sanctions. If we had targeted these sanctions or use instruments that would really go for the leaders and not necessarily the private sector, we would have achieved other results, and Zimbabwe today would be producing for itself, but also for the Southern Africa continent.
To follow up on that, sanctions are on and sanctions can be off. There's been one change of leadership there, although not much change in the style. My question, though, had been within the African community, why even if there are some sanctions on us, there are no sanctions on their neighbors. Why? What would it take to do it? And then, if we were to change our strategy, allow trade development, allow that, what would be the necessary steps internally in Zimbabwe and in the region to restore what was once the breadbasket of Africa? Because ultimately, you mentioned productivity. My greatest question is not what aid we can give to Africa, but where can we have Africa be able to produce for itself? And wheat is certainly one of them historically. And as you say, being able to process your minerals to a greater level. So that's why I asked what China had done in either of those areas. And specifically in the case of Zimbabwe, which I visited, if we're able to work with the administration to lift some sanctions in a targeted way, would we be able to get support for changes internally that would allow their productivity to rise? Ultimately, their productivity is not just the sanctions. There were other internal problems in distribution that led to that.
Precisely. And I think I couldn't agree with you more, particularly that it is not simply sanctions that lead to the collapse of agriculture. There are internal constraints, some of which would be because in the perceived failure of the state to be able to guarantee private sector investment, what has happened then, the farmers themselves, some of the farmers have had to leave. Some of the farmers ended up going to countries like DRC or Nigeria. But if they had been given an opportunity to be able to continue to produce and export, because Zimbabwe was already exporting to even the US, they would have stayed on and continued to do that. So that's why I still emphasize that, yes, we know that sanctions is a reality of life, but those sanctions then must be, and I seem to get the impression that you're saying, yes, they can be targeted, and I absolutely agree with that. That yes, if a country goes rogue, we can always apply targeted sanctions, but not blanket, which affects even the innocent farms, so that those farms then, they themselves can continue to lobby. But once the farms, look at what happened in Ethiopia. You know, when the sanctions were applied, Ethiopia could not be able to export. And some of those companies, which American companies, private sectors companies, had to be in that kind of limbo. And so, yes, let us try to encourage the private sector, which can be a lobby. And this is why, if the sanctions are targeted, those leaders will be under pressure to change.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. This is why I have problems with our policies regarding sanctions. Representative Omar, our Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I guess we all have problems with our policies around sanctions. Thank you so much for having this hearing today. Mr. Secretary General, it is an honor to have you here with us today. As you know, in 2017, the UN Economic Commission for Africa published a report outlining human rights framework for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. That report made a number of recommendations about thinking of free trade in Africa around human rights perspective, and particularly in avoiding the perception that the agreement will serve to benefit only the rich. Can you tell us what of those recommendations have been implemented? And if you see a relationship between the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the priorities related to democracy, governance, and human rights?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Vice Chairwoman. There is a framework in the African Union on democracy, on human rights, and that framework applies to all of the different and various organs of the African Union, of which we are. And so respect for democracy, human rights, respect for the normal democratic process in countries is a very critical pillar of the African Union. That is why the African Union has come out very, very strongly against unconstitutional changes of power or governments in Mali, in Burkina Faso, as well as in Guinea Conakry. So we may not have a standalone protocol on trade and human rights. We may not have a standalone protocol relating to that within the legal architecture of the AfCFTA. However, we are bound by the overall adherence of the African Union to these values that I have just expressed. But we have approached this from the point of view of inclusivity, as I mentioned earlier, inclusivity for young people, creating opportunities for young people to trade across borders, creating opportunities for small, medium enterprises that are led by women to trade across borders with as little hindrance, either at law or in any other form as possible. So that's how we approach it from the trade point of view, from the point of view of inclusivity, creating opportunities. And as you correctly said, if we implement this agreement in such a way that only the big countries in Africa benefit, or only the big corporations in Africa benefit, we are not going to succeed. We have, as the numbers were mentioned, by the year 2025, our continent will have the most dynamic and youngest population in the world. So we have to create conditions where young people have the opportunity to expand their markets from the countries where they do business to other parts of the continent. We are already seeing that, but we're not seeing it in a structured way. We're not seeing it in a way that is anchored by this legal agreement. We are seeing already young women in Malawi who are producers of value-added agricultural products finding a market for themselves in West Africa, in North Africa. And this is, of course, in the absence of a trade agreement in the Trade Secretariat. And so that's why my view is that if we want to address questions of human rights, let's do so in the context of the trade agreement, inclusivity of benefits, shared benefits, so that not only the big countries benefit from this trade agreement. If I may just pick up on the point on Zimbabwe, I was in Zimbabwe last year, and I'm sorry I misunderstood that the question was directed at me initially. I was in Zimbabwe last year. I'm going to Zimbabwe again next month. We are mobilizing private sector, global investors, because Zimbabwe has actually transformed their industrial policies, their economic policies, to make them more investor friendly. From what I've seen, that is why a Swiss company today, a global $20 billion turnover company, is willing to go to invest in Zimbabwe because the government has a new industrial and economic policy that recognizes the importance of engaging the global private sector as they re-industrialize and as they rebuild their economy. And so I would also join Ambassador Mwencha in urging that we relook at Zimbabwe, particularly from the point of view of investing in productive sectors of Zimbabwe to enable Zimbabwe to get back to the position that Zimbabwe was in 20 years ago or so. And that's why we're going back there next month with Swiss investors to see what can we do, for example, to bring in the agricultural sector to be part of the value chain for the pharmaceuticals area. There are a number of different things that Zimbabwe is doing. They are already exporting oxygen, which was a high commodity at the height of the pandemic. They are already producing their own germ-killing products, all of these products that are required to fight the pandemic on the back of the agricultural sector. But we need to do more to mobilize investors to work with the government of Zimbabwe so that we see the improvements that all of us want to see. Thank you.
Wonderful. Madam Chairwoman, I've used up all my time, but if there's follow-up, I would like to go again.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Carry
okay. To that point of more things that we could be done, what would your advice be for U.S. policymakers about pitfalls that we should avoid and policies that we can help to promote to make sure Africans, and as you all have alluded to in your testimonies, young Africans as well, the youth of Africa? You can take that, or maybe Dr. Signé can answer.
Thank you very much.
Well,
please
sorry,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Professor, please.
I insist, Excellency. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will be brief, Congresswoman. I think that we should focus on interventions that will improve inclusivity in implementation of a trade agreement. I mentioned when I was in Washington a month or so ago that if the interventions we should be exploring are those that are going to create the biggest impact in the fastest period of time. For example, if Development Finance Corporation can say, we will guarantee small, medium enterprise loans, a trade finance facility up to $2 billion, whatever the case may be, that will enable us to bring in more small, medium enterprises to trade. Yes, when there's a crisis, a food crisis, bags of maize meal, they do help, but a long-term impactful intervention is one that creates opportunities for small, medium enterprises and for young people. And so we are creating a digital marketplace, AfCFTA digital marketplace, with the support of the MasterCard Foundation. And this digital marketplace will bring in small, medium enterprises. However, we will need the trade finance facility to support that, so that as they trade across borders, they have the capital that that they need to do so. My apologies, Professor. I just wanted to briefly respond.
My pleasure, Excellency. So thank you very much, Vice Chair Omar, for the question. So we have different levers, and I think I'm supporting and endorse what Excellency Mene has just said. In order to capitalize on young people and also women, there are different dimensions to consider. One being entrepreneurship and SMEs, because young people are twice as likely to be unemployed than the current generation. So which means that government and corporations cannot create enough jobs for young people on the continent. And it is therefore extremely important to promote entrepreneurship and SMEs, which could be done from the US side by expanding the role of the US African Development Foundation, which is already investing, but I think the budget is quite small. So if the budget could be triple, quadruple, that could make a difference. But I also think that the DFC, for example, could leverage some existing fund in Africa, whether the Fund for Export Development in Africa or partner with the African Development Bank to really channel more resources toward the growth of SMEs and infrastructure development. And unlocking the potential of SMEs and of young people on the continent could also be done through the collaboration between the African American or the African diaspora and African back home. And that's one of the reasons why I think that really further investing, further providing resources, including in the United States, to the US Small Business Administration or to the Minority Business Development Agency could really help unlock the potential of the young people on the continent, because quite often when SMEs conduct business between the US and Africa, young people are involved. I will land by saying also about the couple of points mentioned earlier, that to address food security in Africa, there's a continental initiative called the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, so which has been launched and is being implemented for almost a few decades for now, and it is really important to build on such existing program, because as you know, about 60% of the world unused arable land is based on Africa, while the continent still face food insecurity. So definitely agriculture, whether in the consumer market, is the largest area of spending, but also in the consumer and business spending, agriculture, food, and beverage are the largest areas of spending. So it is definitively also by encouraging young people to embrace those opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Representative Omar is finished.
It looks like Ms. Liser wants to add something, if that's
Okay,
permitted
sure.
by you, Chairwoman.
Sure.
Just very briefly, I actually wanted to come in on the point about African countries losing their AGOA eligibility. And I just wanted to point out, I actually had a conversation with the person who runs the GSP program from USTR. It was about a year ago, but I was thinking about this whole issue when Ethiopia was looking like they were going to lose their eligibility, and unfortunately they did. So just two quick points. It is important for AGOA to have eligibility criteria that have to do with governance and rule of law and all of that. But what I was learning from the person who handles GSP is that, first of all, they're not reviewed every year. There's no annual review for the 100 and odd countries that are eligible for GSP. And it's only in the last few years that they are reviewed every 3 years by groups, all the Africans, all the Latin Americans, all the Asians, but you're only reviewed every 3 years. But there are countries who have not lost their GSP eligibility despite some tremendously terrible things that are happening in those countries. Probably Burma or Myanmar would be an example of that. And so what I was thinking was that under AGOA, maybe we look at what are the other tools and options for addressing some of the issues that have caused Africans to lose their eligibility, aligning that process with what it is we do for everybody else in the world. And even someone told me that those products coming in from that region of China, I always get it confused what it is, but that it was just those products that have been eliminated from entry. They're not eligible for GSP, but China's products as a whole have not been blocked. I mean, we would have nothing if we blocked all of China's products, but products specifically from that area where they were having those human rights issues, those were blocked. So I think that there are other options and methods for dealing with legitimate concerns about governance and rule of law in Africa. But what we do under AGOA is different than what we do for other countries who have access to our preferential program. So I just want to stop there. But that, I think that's an important thing to think about for the next iteration of AGOA. Thank you.
Representative Omar?
No, you've been generous with the time, so I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, well, let me just actually continue there because Madam CEO Liser, I really do want us to look at that, and maybe it's something that we could do this year because I think the way we handle AGOA is real problematic. I don't even know if in the Ethiopia situation it would have been able to target a specific area like China. But you know, where you and your organization spend all this time trying to get companies to do business in Africa, and then companies do that, but knowing that if anything happens domestically in that country, they can be banned from doing business. And it just seems like it defeats our overall purpose. And then we complain about China's involvement in Africa. So I would really hope that you would expand on that, Ms. Liser, and come up with some very specific ideas around, I mean, I think number one, pointing out the differences of how African countries are dealt with differently. When we're really worried about and dependent on the products, for some reason, we don't see the same human rights abuses. I think you were talking about the Uyghur camps. I think that's the area you were talking about. I did want to ask you, though, you talked about adding services in AGOA. And just thinking of GSP, how do you quantify that? How do you, I mean, our services aren't really subject to tariffs, are they? How would you do services in AGOA?
Well, it would have to have just as in an FTA, you have a services chapter, and you agree that there are going to be, you're going to liberalize the provision of certain services so that, for example, if you wanted to set up a bank in a particular country, you know, countries may have rules and regulations that don't allow foreign banking or financial institutions to come in. So the way that services liberalization has worked in free trade agreements is that the two countries or the multiple countries where it's done multilaterally, like what they were going to do in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is you identify a series of services sector and you say these sectors will be open to you know, for establishment by our partners, right? Because they are also allowing us to freely establish services in those countries and provide those services in the partner country or countries. So again, it has to be handled the way that services trade is handled. But I think that liberalization of services trade has been a critical part of all of the U.S. Free trade agreements, you know, whether it's Australia or Chile or Mexico and Canada or whoever. So it would follow something similar to that if we could.
I see. Well, thank you. I guess we're going to have to call on you a lot as we develop AGOA. But given the role you played in it before, I think it's very appropriate. I wanted to ask the final question of the Secretariat. You mentioned the digitalization where the U.S. could be helpful. And I know in our document, we were looking at digitalization of border crossings and custom procedures. Would you, is that what you were referring to specifically? And then how specifically can the U.S. Help? Is it technical assistance from our tech companies? Is it cash? What, I mean, obviously cash is always good. But what were you thinking of specifically how the U.S. could be helpful with that part of the trade area?
Thank you very much again for the question. Where I am today in Ghana, Right 300 kilometers away from me is the capital of Togo, Lomé. One is French speaking, the other one is English speaking. When you drive to the border, you see trucks on either side of the border. And that's because the systems are not interoperable. And that's the case across many, many countries in Africa, except in the East African community, where over the last 10 to 15 years, they have invested significantly in digitization of customs procedures and ensuring free transit. So what I have the ambition for us to do is to create a digital platform for customs procedures and transit. And it may not be the US government, but certainly tech companies that already that have the technical capacity to advise us on what would be the best option, interoperability of languages, different currencies as goods are trading across. So this is something that certainly, whether it's Microsoft or Google or any other US tech companies who may have an interest to address this massive challenge. It is also an opportunity, I should say, because it has not been done before at a continental scale, at a large scale. So whilst it's a big challenge, it's also an opportunity at innovation, and it's also an opportunity for us to once again demonstrate that free trade can actually be embedded on technological advancements, and it can create conditions where the people that we are talking about, these small medium enterprises that export across borders, where they can see efficiencies for their businesses and their trade, and that's how we contribute to inclusivity of this trade agreement. And so I think mobilizing and working with the tech companies is a very, very good starting point on this question of digitization of trade in Africa.
Thank you very much. And with this, I'm sorry, Dr. Mwencha, Ambassador. And Representative Omar, our Vice Chair, would you mind taking over for me for a couple of minutes?
Of course, Madam Chair.
Okay, and you can, if you run out, you can feel free to adjourn. I need to go speak at another committee. Let me just thank all of the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as you leave, I want to thank you again for giving us this opportunity to testify and look forward to continue to work with you in advancing US-Africa course. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you.
Let me comment on two aspects, and that is on services and also digitization that Proli referred to, but also Ambassador Mene. Now, on services, the services we're talking about is health, education, transport, and banking. If I could give an example of particularly transport, African exporters and importers encounter up to more than 40% of the value of the product at the consumer point. And that is because of inefficiencies, whether it will be at the border, on road, or border posts, where there is a lot of time consumed, documentation, and also bureaucracy. And for that, US could also support in some of those areas, particularly in modernization of some of the ports, but also at the border points. Now, in the area of transport, African producers exporting the US find it very difficult to be able to compete with other producers who come from, say, Latin America or Asia. Because if you look at the turnaround time for exporters, say, off Mombasa to the US, the time taken, the goods are never going to be competitive. And so one of the things that we could do is then to encourage shipping companies that come and dock in African ports, but also encourage the development of this facility in Africa, joint ventures. Some of the areas that one could refer to health, US is a leading country in the sector of health and pharmaceuticals, but also in diagnostic health. And here again, if there was an opportunity for US to partner with African physicians, where the modern technology that can be used, this could be of great help that Africa can leapfrog and be able to access that health rather than today, African sick patients have to go to India or the US for treatment when actually working with similar counterparts here, this can be achieved. On digitization, and giving the example of what Ambassador Mene has talked about, Trademark East Africa that I referred to, we have been working with East African community to support the transport corridors. If you look at the work that has been done from the port of Dar es Salaam into Burundi and DRC, but also Mombasa, Uganda, Rwanda, and just giving one metric, before trademark came in, it took around 42 days for goods to come to Mombasa port and reach Rwanda. With trademark and working with the leaders of the region, this time has been reduced to 6 or 5 days. Now imagine how much back trips you would be able to make if you are going 42 days as opposed to 5 days. And we want to believe that this time can be reduced further. And here is again where a lot of support from the US that has come in through USDA. And we want to continue this in support, particularly what Ambassador Mene has mentioned, doing the corridors in West Africa and also other corridors in Southern Africa so that we can make trade more efficient and easier. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think we'll wrap up soon, but I wanted to see if maybe, I know that we've all talked a lot about food insecurity quite a lot. And Dr. Signé, when you said 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa, I'm curious if you and the rest of the panel maybe can help us understand what specific investment can be made to make sure that Africa is able to increase its ability to produce food.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair, for the extremely important question. I think there are different dimensions where support or interventions are extremely important. One is at the government level and the other is in the private sector. So from the government perspective, one of the barriers for agricultural productivity is really the cost of doing business, the entrance, the infrastructure. When a farmer, you have no road to connect a rural area where farmers are producing and a specific market. So those are critical challenges. So access to market, especially for small farmers, but also definitively those infrastructure which plays a role. So the government should really intervene in unlocking those barriers to productivity by reducing the cost for doing business and building more infrastructure and providing agricultural entrance. So that is one dimension. Now we also have the private sector dimension. So many solutions and technologies have been developed, especially related to the fourth industrial revolution, digital tools among others, and they have been very successful across the continent. But one of the challenges is really to scale some of those innovation, whether drone-based innovation, mobile phone-based innovation to improve agricultural productivity. So quite often, the solutions are only effective for a limited number of producers. So, and a strategy to scale those is to really scale up some of those innovation is really to invest in the private companies which are developing such innovations. So those are the two key dimensions that I see. So the one dimension, government have to do more better in addressing the core barriers to agricultural productivity. And on the other hand, the private sector, some of the solutions which evolve from the private sector have also to be scaled and to be expanded. And related to those questions of technology, a way the US can further support is to really help some of the African countries developing a grand strategies related to digitalization or to the fourth industrial revolution, because many solutions already exist around the world. However, why don't we have those identify, assess, and with options provided depending on the cost-benefit structure? So that is one of the dimensions. Another is also agility. So quite often, government are slow in really adopting the innovation or following up with some of the innovation, especially when those disrupt the existing legal environment. So, and I think like there's also an opportunity for the United States to share its experiences in terms of agile and in terms of agility and agile governance. An additional dimension is really, and I mentioned it earlier, the investment in the digital infrastructure, both the digital infrastructure and the physical infrastructure, because many of the farmers are living in rural areas which are covered asymmetrically compared to some of the urban centers. So those are some of the areas which can really help addressing the agricultural challenges. And probably to end, I will finish by adding a couple of when AGOA, the design of AGOA should be different. It should be expanded with special role of origin, especially in the context of global supply chain. If the US want to reduce dependency towards some of the region like Asia, so having special rule of origin for more product, including transformed products, will definitively help, and supporting continental initiatives such as the comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, which has been implemented already by numerous countries, will also make a monumental difference. I will stop there because I see that my colleagues have a lot.
Yes, I mean, everyone, if please add your point, and then we'll just close out. Ms. Liser?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Vice Chair. So I actually wanted to just address this issue of food security from a slightly different angle. It has always troubled me, and everybody that knows me knows this, that so many of Africa's products leave the continent raw, as raw commodities, and get processed in other places. And so even though we're talking about growing more of their own, we know on the one hand that there's a fair amount of wastage that happens on the continent. But if more of Africa's raw products were captured in the value chain and processed, there are a number of things that would happen. First, you'd be attracting investment into value-added manufacturing and agribusiness on the continent. Number two, you'd be hiring more people. You'd be developing jobs further up the value chain. So you're not just talking about what the farmers do, but you're talking about what all the people who process those products along the way do. And finally, you're providing more resources to those people who, even though they may not grow whatever the product is, they now have more resources to be able to buy what they need in terms of food and food security. And I just have to share one fact that bothers me and still bothers me to this day, even though it's changing. More than 70% of Africa's cashews, just as an example, are processed in Vietnam and Bangladesh and India, Vietnam and India. And the interesting thing is that that whole industry of cashew processing in Vietnam was developed by other people. People bought the machinery, invested the money. It is enormous. And now Vietnam needs Africa's raw cashews in order for them to support that industry, which employs tens of thousands of people. So you're shipping the raw cashews all the way down to South Asia, creating jobs there, getting investment there. And now the Africans are saying, well, can't we process more of our own cashews here? And there are lots of reasons. People will tell you why it can't happen. I don't want to go into all of it. Some of it is financing. Some of it is the machinery that the Africans need that's produced by the Indians. The Indians have a vested interest in the Vietnamese processing of cashews because they're the ones who built that industry up. So the Africans can't even get the machinery that they need sometimes to process their own cashews, create their own jobs, and get the resources from their own product. So that's just like one example. And I can tell you, Vice Chair, this happens across many value chains in Africa. So we have to stop this, not stop it, but we have to incentivize investment that goes to Africa to develop their agricultural products there in Africa. Thank you.
Okay.
Wow.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. I want to build on what Floria said, but also Landry. First, in terms of improving agriculture, we need to look at the methods of farming in agriculture. We are talking of more than almost 80% of Africa's population is depend on agriculture. And if you look at the productivity in agriculture, whether it's per acre or per animal, it's the least in the world. And that is because, to start with, for instance, the simple technology. Africans are using, by and large, handheld hoe for tilling their land. Simple mechanization, but that will require that you support the farmer in terms of having access to finance, but also supporting them not to lose some of the crops on the farm. If you look at food losses, ex-farm, when it's been harvested, what you call post-harvest food losses is almost 30%. So improving harvesting methods, but also improving seed, land, and the rest. Equally important is to look at the issue of land reforms so that we can look at how Africa is managing its land. Perhaps one controversial point I like to introduce here is the question of subsidy. And you know, this has been a controversial subject, whether it's at the WTO. Unfortunately, some of the countries in the rest of the world subsidize, but also they dump their products in Africa. That makes the African farmer less competitive. And some of it could be given in aid form or whatever form. If there was a situation, for instance, there is famine, for argument's sake, say in Somalia, why don't you procure from neighboring country, Kenya, rather than import all the way from United States? That way you encourage African farmers, because once you bring that kind of subsidy, it kills local production, particularly production cycles. But also globally, this is also a subject that we should address squarely on how to manage the subsidy. But I want to agree, particularly the point that Frody has raised. If you look at what Ghana has done in the area of cocoa, agriculture farmers only get 15% of the value of the product when it is not processed ex-farm, but exported.
Could you
So
ask
it's
somebody to get?
out there, like what is mentioned. If we just add value, you will see African farmers becoming richer and instead of being poorer. In fact, if you look at African farmers, it's the most affected community in the continent because they are getting poorer and poorer. Hence, insecurity that will come because young people are trooping into towns because agriculture is no longer a business and therefore creating instability and migration and all the rest of the challenges.
Let me, you okay, Ms. Vice Chair?
I don't know if the secretary wanted to add. He was the only one that didn't give a comment on this, but I am okay. Thank you. Thank you all again for your input and your testimonies. Really appreciate it.
If the Secretariat's going to jump in, let me add a question on, because I did want, you were talking about the digitalization and you mentioned the East African communities. And so I wanted to know who did it there. And if it is a Microsoft or a Google issue, then it would be great to work with them. But how were the East African communities able to do it?
Thank you very much. So the intervention in the East African community was led by, as Ambassador Mwencha said, by Trademark East Africa, with the support of primarily DFID, that is the former DFID, the UK Development Agency. And it was a long-term intervention of 10, 15 years, investing in infrastructure, physical as well as soft infrastructure, and of course, investing in the border posts themselves. Just to give you an example, when I was at the port of Mombasa that Ambassador Mwencha mentioned, they have a command center, and through digital technologies, they're able to track trucks that are coming in as far away along the corridor, as far away as South Sudan, going into the port or leaving the port to various destinations in East Africa. And so these are interventions that have made a substantive difference in trade efficiency along the Northern Corridor in particular. What I have in mind is building on that, from not only from the point of view of hard infrastructure, which is important, building world-class ports and borders, but from a technology standpoint, how do we look at the success story of East Africa, and how do we model that throughout the entire continent using the latest technological advancements? This is something that I think is possible. I'd be the last person in the world to tell you how. I don't know, because I'm not a tech expert, but I do know that with the expertise of and the support of the US government and entities, we can have, which we can all be proud of, we can have a digitization of trade that is actually world-class, that supports implementation of a trade agreement in a way in which we have not seen anywhere around the world. So I think it's a very unique opportunity to work with the private companies, the tech companies, to find solutions to how do we digitize trade, transit at borders, and of course ensure inclusivity and affordability of trade on the African continent. My view is that these are the kinds of interventions that are critical to make sure that the US and those US investors who are here, that they see return on their investments, that in turn we will see jobs being created here. We will see faster transit of goods. We will see faster transit of services across our borders. And so this is what I think is one of the practical interventions that can be made.
Well, thank you. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of our witnesses and for your patience today. This has been very, very helpful. I certainly want to see the United States step up. And after listening to Ms. Liser's comments about the cashews, I mean, it's like the whole world joins in exploiting Africa. And it just seems like we have to figure out how the whole world comes together and recognizes that Africa's success is really the success of the world, considering the population, the age, and all of that. And it creates a tremendous opportunity for the youth, for the young people, to the extent that the trade agreement really grows. I think it's great that the continent is working with Europe, but it sure seems like that needs to be Asia, Latin America, and the United States as well. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time, your expertise, your contributions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for.
Thanks for having us.
Sure. We're now adjourned.
Thank you.